after my son was born. I was sitting in a doctor's office, gazing at him. I don't really remember all that much about the first couple weeks of his life, but gazing played a really big role in it. I remember telling him, "Oh my God, you are 5 days old. And someday you will be 5 weeks old. And then you will be 5 months old. And someday you will be 5 years old." And I could not imagine that possibility. And yet I was so certain that it was going to be glorious, that I was going to be transformed by it, that my world would never be the same. This powerful feeling of uncertainty and joy. And I feel a little bit like that standing here today. Slight difference of degree. But I stand here today on my first Sunday. And I know that someday it will be my first week, and then my first month. We'll have a handful of Sundays and more and more. My first year, who knows where the universe will take us, and I know it will be joyful, and I'm not quite sure what it'll look like. I'm just now starting to be able to pick out a couple of faces in the crowd who I've seen more than once. I got someone's name right this morning. I was so proud of myself. And someday, I'll stand here, and I'll know every single one of you. I'll know your names. Hopefully I'll know the things that bring you joy. I'll know the things I do that you really don't like. I'll probably do them anyhow. We will know each other. We will have built something, and I am certain of that, and I don't know what it will look like. And I have a hard time imagining it. That sense of joyful, certain anticipation is at our best what our new beginnings are. When we welcome someone new, not just a new minister, a new face, a new kid, sometimes we remember that joyful possibility. We look at someone and we know, I'm going to watch you grow up. I'm going to know you years from now when we've sat through meetings together and sung together, held hands or not held hands in that awkward in-between during church where you're not quite sure if you're supposed to touch or not. At our best, we start something new, and we are welcomed into joyful possibility. But I, alas, am not always at my best, nor are we. And sometimes I profoundly identify with that hermit crab, scuttling across looking for safety. Sometimes someone new does not feel like a joyful possibility. It feels scary. And I want to be the minister who throws the doors open wide and says, everyone, 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 always, always, always. I want to say, what have you to fear? And I know we have a lot to fear. I know we live in a world where a lot of us are scared a lot of the time. We live in a world where, in more than half of the country, women aren't allowed to make basic decisions about their bodies. We live in a world where people think that children should be denied medical care because of who they are. We live in a world that can be really scary. And it is tempting to find the places we feel safe, to find our little houses and stay in them. And it has been tempting to do that forever. One of my favorite stories from our history, which much like my origin story is probably about 60% true, is about the first time a group of Unitarian ministers got together. This is a new theology. They were excited. They all gathered. They talked about new ideas and new thoughts. Like early 1700s. So I think you can imagine what these ministers looked like. And at the end of their meeting, someone said, hey, should we advertise? Should we put out notices saying, hey, the Unitarians are meeting at this time? And the general consensus was, oh, no. Because the wrong people might show up. Now, as someone who has proudly been the wrong people for all of my life, I have often heard that story told from a place of, can you believe how closed-minded they were and how insular? And there was some of that. There has always been some of that. But I also think they were scared. In the 1700s, we weren't that far off from a time where people in this country and the countries they had come from were killed for having different religious beliefs. And they had some pretty different religious beliefs. They had been shunned by their colleagues, sometimes by their congregations. And I think it felt safer to stay with the people they knew were on their team. Sometimes it feels safer to stay with people who we know are on our team. But here's what I'd like to go back and tell them, assuming they would let me talk, which no one ever gets safer by hiding. Sometimes you can stay safe for a minute, and sometimes you have to. Sometimes you need to hide, to regenerate, to get your energy up, to find your team. Sometimes you need to. But no one has ever gotten safer by hiding. At some point, we're going to have to go out into the world and say who we are. And when we do that, we are made safer by being together. Imagine all of the people who could have joined the team if they were willing to advertise. The people who didn't look quite like them or believe quite like them, the women, the people of color, the people of less education, all the people who probably would have liked to have been on their team. No one gets safer by hiding, and we don't get stronger by turning inwards. And so, I start something new, and I have the push-pull of the joyful possibility and the very real fear that sometimes the world is a scary place. And in the vast in-between of that push-pull, there is a more everyday sort of thing. You meet someone new, a little part of you has joyful anticipation, a little part of you has fear, and most of you has, oh no, am I going to make it weird? There's been a lot of talk about weird in our nation of late. And I'm not talking about the kind of weird where you think you get to decide, let alone care, what other people do in their bedrooms. I'm not talking about the kind of weird where you think that kids should have tests for what their sex is before they can play sports. Not that kind of weird. I mean like the everyday, oh, I'm so glad to meet you, to someone who looks at you and says, yes, we've met before. With the tone of, and clearly you didn't care enough to remember. It's the uncomfortable of making fun of a book you just read and finding out that someone else has read it 15 times and it's at the heart of their theology. I've obviously never done that. It's the kind of uncomfortable of seeing someone in coffee hour and thinking, like, I think they're new. But like, what if they're not? What do I say? How do I say it? It's the not being quite sure what you've talked about or what people care about. It's the rough edges of being human. The rough edges that are exacerbated by differences of race and gender and sexual orientation and class, and so it is tempting to just not, which then that's kind of why they were exacerbated in the first place. There's a desire to make things easy. to be comfortable, which God knows we all need sometimes. And if the question is just, is it worth it to have this uncomfortable interaction just because, then the answer is kind of always going to be no. But if the question is, if I stick my neck out and risk being the one who made it awkward, might we someday have breathless, joyful anticipation of who we are together? If I say hello to that person who I'm pretty sure is new, might we someday be able to go out into the world speaking our truth together just a little bit stronger? Worth it. I think it's worth it. I hope it's worth it to you. If it's not, you picked wrong. Talk about that later. I want to invite us, in this moment of new beginning, to risk making it a little awkward, to tell our truths out loud, knowing we're going to mess it up when we've broken our vows 1,000 times. Don't sing that song without that part, because we will. Over and over and over again, we will disappoint each other by accident, sometimes on purpose. We will sing songs that we can't stand, make statements that feel uncomfortable, greet people we've met before, use the wrong names. We will break our vows 1,000 times. And we will come, and yet again come. Let this be a place where we know it's worth it to risk being a little bit awkward so that we can find our team. So that in a month and a year, we know each other. We know who has our backs. We know that when our little hermit crab selves scuttle across the water, there are other people watching out for us, protecting us, and rooting us on. May it be so. Amen.